a cockroach, a zombie, Doctor Who. However you look at it, you cannot kill the Champions Trophy. It has been cancelled, ignored, and has had more costume changes than a chorus girl, but it will never die. Yet there's one question that comes to mind when you bring up the Champions Trophy. What's the point? What's the point of playing a tournament that's not a World Cup when we already have enough of those already? What's the point of playing a tournament with the same major teams as the World Cup? What is the point of a tournament when you keep cancelling it only to bring it back at random intervals? And maybe the most important one is, what even is the Champions Trophy? Occasionally, I also talk about behind the scenes stuff. A huge thanks to everyone who has supported us on Patreon and helped us build this channel. Join our Patreon community and unlock exclusive benefits. Enjoy AMAs, live calls with me, and connect with fellow cricket enthusiasts on Discord. This tournament has been a lot of things, and also names. It was born as the Wills International Cup, so that we had another major tournament to generate income between the actual World Cups. At that point, it was essentially supposed to be used to grow the game outside of the test nations. That is why the first two editions were held in Bangladesh and Kenya. Remember, this was years before the first T20 was ever played, and the ODI World Cup was just more of an actual World Cup played once every 4 years. So the idea at that point that another global tournament could drive revenue and help grow the sport may not have actually necessarily been a bad one. In 1998, the Wills International Cup, not to be confused with the Wills World Cup that was played just 2 years before. It's important to also remember that everything in cricket used to be sponsored by cigarettes. Wisden actually called it the Mini World Cup, and it was played in Bangladesh. But that was only the third choice venue, with even Florida being considered in the early planning stage. The idea was to feature the full member nations in a knockout tournament, but that was the first hitch. There were 9 test playing nations at that stage. So a preliminary round was to be played between 2 countries. It was announced that the seedings would be decided based on the placings in the 96 World Cup. But then, when the fixtures were eventually released, something else happened. Sources close to the Bangladesh Cricket Board confirmed to the Daily Star that the ICC's commercial interests had been given maximum preference when preparing the draw. So while the ranking suggested that England should be in the preliminary knockout, suddenly it was New Zealand up against Zimbabwe. So we were fixing schedules and events well before the BCCI were around. Weirdly enough though, it was a great game to start things off, and Zimbabwe nearly knocked New Zealand out. Their captain Alistair Campbell made 100, and New Zealand's Stephen Fleming almost got one himself. But the hero was Chris Harris, whose rampage at the end was incredible, with New Zealand needing to chase 40 of the last 3 overs. And that was not a normal chase in ODIs back then. Clearly, he should have been the player of the match, but the award ended up going to Fleming, which was apparently a mistake. The story is that Ravi Shastri, making the award on behalf of the TV commentators, couldn't read whose name was scribbled down on the note he got at the presentation. What a way to start cricket's greatest minor major tournament. Afterwards, not even the cricket-crazy Bangladeshis were able to fill up the stadium. The final ended up being contested between South Africa and the West Indies. Not really the best result for the ICC's commercial interests. But it was South Africa's first major tournament final, and it ended up being their maiden, and so far only, ICC Senior Tournament Trophy. The stars for the Proteas were Jacques Kallis, Henry Cronje, and Mike Rendell. You've probably heard of the first 2 guys. If you've heard of the third one, you're a Champions Trophy truther. And that's another thing to look out for with the Champions Trophy. The most random cricketers have often starred in that. In the final, my friend Phil Wallace was the highest run getter. Steve Elworthy and Merv Dillon were also amongst the highest wicket takers. Unfortunately though, the crowds just weren't great. But the tournament did work, and the ICC ended up making $10 million. Enough to convince them to try it again in a couple of years. In 2000, things were taken a bit more seriously. First, the tournament was rebranded as the ICC Knockout Trophy. That made it sound less like a mini World Cup. The hosting rights were given to Kenya, and the hosts were invited to play, unlike the previous edition. The ICC also flew out their pitch consultant Andy Atkinson to work on the wickets to make them even more suitable for high-scoring games. Bangladesh were also invited to play this time, meaning there were 11 teams in total. So the preliminary round was given a fancy new name, the pre-quarterfinals. I love how cricket will just make up a new term just so they don't have to invite more teams. This time the whole thing was not decided on the ICC's commercial interests, but on seedings from the 1999 World Cup. Even India and England had to play in the first round. New Zealand went on to win their first ever global title when they beat the hot favourites India in the final. All-rounder Chris Cairns was the star of the show for the Kiwis with 100 coming in at number 5, and they chased down 264. Though attendance was low throughout, this time the tournament ended up making $13 million US, and perhaps also played a part in Kenya going on to make the semi-final of the 2003 World Cup. So in terms of what the tournament objectives were, earn money and grow the game, things were actually moving in the right direction. By the end of the 2002 tournament, the big question of why are we really playing this started to come up. The name was changed again, and it was now the ICC Champions Trophy. They stopped trying to host it in a country to grow the sport. India was supposed to host, but the government refused to grant tax exemption, and so it was moved to Sri Lanka. And it wouldn't be the last time it was hard to find a host nation for this tournament. The knockout element was dropped, and another team was invited, making the total number of 12. No more pre-quarters, whatever they were, and they now had a full-on league phase with 4 groups. However, scheduling was not ideal, with it being played 5 months out from the World Cup, which had just 2 more teams. So it was somewhere between a warm-up and a slightly mini World Cup. Oh, and it was scheduled to clash with Sri Lanka's monsoon season. So we were going to have 15 matches in 18 days, which turned into 16 matches in 19 days. Sri Lanka won the toss and batted in the final, scoring 244 before rain came 2 overs into India's chase. Luckily, there was a reserve day. But a bizarre rule meant the game had to start again from scratch the next day. So Sri Lanka won the toss again, they batted again, and this time they scored 227. India were 8.4 overs into their reply when the game was called off, and the teams were declared joint winners. 110 overs were bowled without a result. It is the most Champions Trophy thing ever to happen. And it is hard to take a tournament serious when you have 2 winners despite having 2 days of cricket. Things just got worse in 2004. The 3rd edition was an organisational disaster class. Matthew Engel and Wisdom described the tournament as one that deserves to be ranked in the list of the great sporting fiascos of our time. Held a year after the World Cup in England, it really seemed like no one at all cared about it. Scheduled at the very back end of the English summer, and we use the word summer in its very loosest term, by that stage cricket had wrung itself dry, hosting 7 tests and 14 ODIs. It just struggled to draw any crowds. And the bloated format of the tournament continued, with the USA taking Netherlands' place this time. They were bowled out for 65 against Australia, and we never really saw much of them again until we let them host a tournament. The only silver lining was that the West Indies, who had suffered a 4-0 drubbing at the hands of England in the Test series, went on to beat that same side in the final. It was an absolute 8th wicket heist when a strong young West Indian batting lineup failed, but a couple of tail-enders gave the West Indies their first title since 1979. The final moments played out in near darkness, but when Ian Bradshaw got on one knee and drove Alex Waugh through point for the winning runs, for a brief moment, it did feel like there was maybe a point to this meaningless, badly organised and freezing cold tournament. In 2006, the ICC brought it back again, but this time no more freebies, and all those other associate teams, they could go do one. The top 6 ranked teams qualified automatically, while the remaining 4 test nations played off for the 2 remaining spots. This time we were in India after government had actually been convinced to grant a tax exemption. Surprisingly, no Asian sides actually made it to the semis. The cricket was good, if unpredictable, but the tournament's most memorable moment turned out to be at the presentation of the trophy. Australia's victorious skipper Ricky Ponting tapped BCCI President Jarrod on the shoulder, gesturing to hand over the trophy, before the Australian team was seen pushing him off the stage in eagerness to celebrate their win. It drew criticism from all parts, and there were even people who took to the streets demanding an apology from the Australians. And this was also supposed to be the last edition of this tournament. The BCCI, by then a proper powerhouse in the game, had put too much of a financial burden on the hosts, and only the World Cups were worth promoting. But you cannot kill this damn thing. And somehow we were back together again in 2009. Pakistan was supposed to host, but security concerns saw the tournament being postponed and then shifted to South Africa. All pretenses of promoting the game outside test nations were completely abandoned by this point, and just the top 8 teams in the world got an invite. Fuck you, Kenya. In the nearly 3 years that had passed since the previous edition, the cricketing landscape had changed dramatically, right? The IPL was now 2 seasons old. India had won the T20 World Cup, and so 20 overs cricket was on the rise. It was already clear that ODIs were being pushed to the back. Australia continued their dominance in the 50-over format and became the first team to win the tournament twice, even if they didn't seem to care all that much about it. It took 4 years for the next edition. This was going to be the last one, the ICC said, as they had previously, because this time it was going to be replaced by a Test Championship in 2017. The cricket was good again, but the organisational blunders surfaced. With no reserve day for the final, in England no less, the title decider was reduced to a 20-over-a-side game, which is pretty funny because this was a tournament in a format that was being eaten alive by 20-over cricket. India beat the host to take their title count to 2, although weirdly, they've never actually won a 50-over final in the Champions Trophy. The 2017 Champions Trophy was probably the best tournament for the ICC's commercial interests. England hosted 2 in a row, not because they were being greedy, but honestly because no one else really wanted it. It was a short and sharp competition that got an India-Australia final. Sure, there was rain and Australia ended up with 2 games washed out, which saw them out in the first round. But still, the cricket was generally pretty good. The organising wasn't terrible, and it was a hugely followed final, thanks to India and Pakistan. Fakhar Zaman's 100 after being dismissed off a no ball, and Mohammad Amir's exquisite opening spell where he picked up Shikhar Dhawan, Rohit Sharma and Virat Kohli gave Pakistan the title in a 180-run win. Was this what we've been waiting for? Just one big money pot game? Is that the point of the Champions Trophy? Money, an India-Pakistan game, white jackets, and a chance to screw over the teams that cricket has already overlooked. Maybe that's it? Perhaps its real justification is just filling up a 3-week window every now and again because the cricket administrators are terrified that one blank spot in the calendar might ruin cricket forever. So what is the future of this tournament? The ICC confirmed that the 2017 edition would be the last one. Here we are in 2025. They said, for reals this time. There was no more room in the schedule. It was done. This might be our last 50-over edition, but that doesn't mean we won't get 20-over versions or something even more weird. Maybe our species gets wiped out on Earth when Elon Musk realizes how to clone himself in different genders on Mars. But would that stop the Champions Trophy? Nah. Every few years, the robots would battle it out for their chance to win the white jackets, playing every 2 to 8 years like clockwork. Because if there is one truth in cricket, it is that you cannot knock out this former knockout. It took God and the demon to build international cricket, but don't tell Johnny Best that. 1882, Australia had played 1 test in England against the god W.G. Grace, and they sucked. So they were playing him again, and it was a tough wicket. But England was in front, so Australia was desperate for a 3rd innings lead. At number 8 was young all-rounder Sammy Jones. After a routine single, he walks down to do some gardening on the pitch. Grace whips off the bails and appeals. The ball wasn't dead, Jones was run out. The Australians were furious. In fact, some of the English players were also furious. But what Grace said went, and the umpires had already given it. Next in was Fred Spofford. He was known as the demon fast bowler. He was furious and he let England know exactly what was coming next, which was maiden. There's 12 maidens. I can't count them all. England only needed 85 to win. W.G. Grace made 32. England only 77. That was the test where the Ashes began. Buy my book, Overthrowing Cricket's Empire, on Amazon today.